Well, hello ever again, everybody. It's time for us to look at about the midpoint of the progressive era here and begin to look at the election of 1912, because election 1912 is going to bring about a number of changes, and some of the issues in this election are going to sound remarkably familiar to you if you've paid any attention to 2020. So there are going to be that big questions that really face America in 1912. And the first one is, should America be a capitalist or some type of socialist or quasi-socialist society? That's going to come along in 1912, and you're going to see the socialists get a huge number of votes, more than in any other election before or really since by capita. And the second is, should government protect social welfare of citizens? Again, this is part of that whole social welfare state that is beginning to take hold in Europe at that time. And some of those ideas are going to make their way to America. Then excuse me, and then the third one is, should women vote and participate as full citizens in the life of a nation? Now, with some of these, we know the answers because we know what's coming and we live in the present, but that's a big question in 1912. And the fourth one, should Americans expand their democracy in other ways? I mean, you're looking at a time when only males could vote and senators were not directly elected. And the democracy as we know it today is a much different animal at that particular time. And the fifth one, should government exercise more control over businesses? Now, that seems to be at the heart of the progressive reform model. Or six, should government try to solve the conflict between capital, i.e., business, and labor, i.e., the workers? That's going to be a big question. And the seventh one, should government work vigorously for the conservation of natural resources? We know that Teddy Roosevelt began that, and it kind of takes a little slip during the Taft administration, but that is going to be a huge question in 1912. So those seven things are what Americans are voting on. And that's going to what we've got here, framing that discussion and providing the direction, it should say, for the administration, not lesson. Lord only knows where that came from. Look at some of the issues here. You know, you see, you've got a moose, you've got a donkey, and you've got an elephant. And in this day, we know that the elephant is the Republican Party, or the grand old party, as it shows here. The donkey is a Democratic Party, but this moose, this bull moose, is going to be something very different. It's a third party that's going to crop. So, what are the big issues here? Now, I've got one piece called The Usual Suspects. And one of them is this idea of direct democracy, of how much should the people influence everything or be allowed to vote on a variety of things. How big is that variety, so to speak? Then there's the labor question. We're dealing with unions, we're dealing with working conditions, we're dealing with all kinds of things. Then there's women's suffrage, which has been, kicking around for at least 30 years in the national consciousness at that point. Then there's a race problem. You've got a huge chunk of America that is not white. What role will that group play? What rights will they be afforded? Will Lincoln's new birth of freedom that he talked about in the Gettysburg Address be real, or is it just going to be words? Then there's the question of the tariff. This tax on imported goods, which was how the vast majority of governmental money was collected. Only problem with the tariff, is that it causes prices to remain relatively high. Well, the good thing, it does protect domestic industry. It does provide a source of government revenue, but it does cause consumer prices to stay artificially inflated. So there's a question there. Then there's the trust, which I think we beat that horse to death. Then there's regulation of business. Then lastly, conversation. Listen at me. Conservation. Those are your general suspects if you look at any textbook on the election of 1912. But there are some that are usually left out. One of them is immigration. What are we going to do with these vast number of foreign-born people flooding into America? And notice even the term I just used, flooding in. That's a term from the time. I mean, we have a large number of immigrants. What are we going to do with them? What role will they play? Then an idea of judicial reform, safety of the food and the medicine supply. We know that from our progressive overview. In the South, especially, this idea of lynching, which goes back to the race problem. I mean, that it's going to be something we're going to look at a little bit more in the 1920s. But this summary feral justice almost always committed against African Americans. And I said feral justice because it's not. It is a tremendous racial injustice, no trial, no nothing. And it happens all over the South with startling regularity. And then this idea of the cost of living. We think about that today quite a bit. Gas prices go up, cost of living goes up. But it's coming to the forefront by 1912. How can people make enough money to live, and not live, comfortably and lavishly, but to survive? Then there is the question of prohibition that is going to become a major progressive issue. The idea of the effects of alcohol and alcoholism have on American society. Should it be outlawed? And so you've got the usual suspects, then you've got some that generally get left out. Major categories for just a second. And we're going to start off with the electorate, the economy, and with equality. And these are going to be kind of interesting because we're going to look at things like the idea of direct democracy. Today we vote for senators directly. In North Carolina, you got a choice between Thom Tillis and Cal Cunningham, and probably some other people. But Tillis and Cunningham are the two that we have. We get to vote to select one of those yahoos to represent us. The electorate is also going to deal with women's suffrage and the idea of judicial reform and what role the judicial branch is going to play. In terms of the economy, we're talking about trust. American Tobacco, Northwest Securities, U.S. Steel, which is formed out of Carnegie Steel. How far we're going to regulate business, whether or not the tariff is going to come up or down, what to do about the cost of living. And then with that idea of progressivism, prohibition, should we outlaw alcohol or demon rum, as some people are going to call it? We've got to get rid of that lynching. Immigration is going to be something that has to be dealt with. The race issues, food and medicine, boom, those major categories. But what happens is we start to get ourselves in the election in 1912. You can't tease these things out into nice, neat little strands. So let's start with economics. There we go. Tariffs, trust, regulation of business, cost of living, absolutely. Or look at social issues. Race, conservation, lynching, prohibition. And then there are political issues, direct democracy, women's suffrage, judicial reform, and immigration. And so what you start to see is these things begin to overlap. Because if you go back to the previous slide or roll your thing back here on the movie, what you're going to see is those are not in the exact same spot that I put them before. It's hard to tease them out. It's like a little Gordian knot. And so you look at economics. All of a sudden it intersects with politics and intersects with society. And what you find out, the election of 1912, all of these are smack dab in the middle of what's going on. Now, we're going to look at two categories here in this particular lecture, and they are going to be political and economic, or AKA the political. This concept of direct democracy. We know that with progressivism, the initiative, people get to propose laws, referendum, they vote on it, recall, get to bring politicians back if you don't like what they do, direct primary, so you get to select the candidates. All of this is designed to express what I've got called here the popular will. That's not what the Founding Fathers wanted, but that's what the government and the ideas of America have morphed themselves into, that we need more direct democracy. To the Founding Fathers, it was a dirty word. To people in 1912, not so much. So then that takes us to women's suffrage. What is that real meaning of our democracy? 52% of the population does not have the right to vote. I mean, that's unconscionable to us today. Was there really a fundamental difference between the two sexes or two genders? I mean, today that argument has changed in so many ways. Whereas back then, that was a very legitimate question, whereas that's one today we don't even deal with. And what you find out is that women's suffrage was not supported by any of the two major parties in that election, but that's going to change incredibly rapidly. And lastly, here's this idea of judicial reform. And it's, should the judiciary or the court system be independent? Or should it be subject to popular will? Well, there's an article today in Bloomberg News about how the court could be packed if the Democrats win. It's got some interesting arguments in it. I'm not sure that any of them hold water, but there are some there. And so it's not something that's unique to 2020. We were talking about this way back in 19. So let's look at direct democracy here for just a second. You see old Tad, boy, he's sitting right there. He looks like me after Thanksgiving dinner. How about progressivism and the recall? I mean, you look at these are tremendous political cartoons showing what they think the effect of some of this direct democracy may be. Or some of the suffrage cartoons. Those are always kind of interesting right there. Or judicial reform. Look at Uncle Sam spilling ink everywhere. Students used to always ask me, what was that he was spilling? It's ink. They didn't understand what a quill and ink pen was. Or here you've got other ones. The idea here is it's change, and change scares the fool out of people sometimes, but you're seeing it by 1912. It is a groundswell. Me for a second, or AKA economics. Well, that's a real stretch. And so what you see that we have tariffs and all kinds of high cost of living. You see Uncle Sam putting it on the backs of people. Trust. Do they contribute to high cost of living? Yes, they want profits to stay up and costs to stay up. Regulation of business, the tariff, the cost of living here. We got a lot of stuff. With trust, it's the questions of whether or not we're going to have a monopoly, how far we're going to regulate trust, and are there legitimately good ones and bad ones? Ones that you can trust and trust that you can trust. Listen to that. And ones that you can't. And then that regulation of business. How far does it go? Does America need to adopt a socialist model? Whereas the government's going to control everything. And then it's who should regulate. Should it be the businesses themselves? Should it be government? That's a real question for 1912. That is not one for us today because it's already been settled. Then you move into the tariff, and it's the idea of who benefits. Well, obviously, the government benefits because it makes money off of it. Big business benefits because it keeps foreign goods out. But who suffers? And that's the American people. And that's the problem, as you can see on the little cartoon to the left. And then there's this idea of government funding. How are we going to do it? This is how the government gets the majority of its money. The frontier has been closed. There is very little public land left to sell in the huge tracts that people are used to. And so the question is, do we tax? How do we do this? And is it a tax or is it a protector for American business? So that's the question that people have to ask themselves as part of this election, and these politicians are going to have to answer. And then the standard of living, cost of living, is, and sometimes there's inflation, whereas your money's worth less. Other times there's deflation at this time where your money's worth more. We've never seen that in our lifetime. But this standard of living, what does it include? Saw an article, 20 years ago now, literally, and it said poverty comes with a color TV. And so it's what is that standard of living, and how much does it cost to stay there? My grandmother Brown did not work outside of the home, or if she did, it was very little. Whereas I cannot imagine our household with my wife staying at home. She's a teacher, which is about like being paid like staying at home. But all of that's rolled into this 1912 election. We're going to decide these things. Living. You got food, which I got me a barrel of flour there. And then you add in rent, or in some cases a mortgage or housing, clothing. Well, I'm telling you what, that's a sharp-looking suit. And then other stuff, which we're just going to call it something. There's just other things, like this Diet Pepsi sitting over here on my desk. Then you add into that some more fuel and light. I just got done paying Duke Power a little while ago, and I don't like that. Then you've got health care. Yep, every month a little bit of it comes out of my check. And Lord, go to the doctor, and there you go. So you got fuel, light, health care, insurance, which would not have been as big a factor depending on what classification of a person you were. Were you working class poor? Then you're not worried about insurance. If you were upper middle class, yes, you are. Okay, and we have to count that in here. In car fare, what I mean by that is be able to get into work and wherever else you need to go. You add those together, and that's the cost of living. Every one of these things impacted interdependently by the stuff we saw on the previous slide. The economy the pieces do not stand on its own. They interlock. Start to look at the candidates here. Great cartoon, and I'll discuss that cartoon a little more in the Woodrow Wilson lecture. Got 4, not 3 like you just saw. Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat from Staunton, Virginia, where he was born, grew up in part of Georgia, then moved back to Virginia. Teddy Roosevelt, who we've already seen before. Now notice he has a P out beside of his name for the Progressive Party. William Taft, who was Roosevelt's handpicked successor, who's now going to have to run against Roosevelt and Wilson, and thought needed a full body shot here, my man Eugene Debs, who's a socialist who runs for president about 800 times. Only William Jennings Bryan and Henry Clay run more times, and I'm joking about that, but Debs does stay on the scene for a while, and at one point will even run for president from a jail cell. I mean, you know, socialism not my thing, but you got to admire a man who runs that many times. So we're going to look at these fellas. And Woodrow Wilson, like I said, there's a whole little presentation on him. You know, he's the son of a Presbyterian minister. He's a Southerner. You know, he's the only president we've ever had with a PhD, and his PhD thesis or dissertation is on how you need to have a strong executive and a weak, legislative branch, i.e., strong president, weak Congress. His career prior to politics, he had been a professor. Then he was the president of Princeton. Wasn't exactly successful as that president, but then he moves into the governorship of New Jersey and later on becomes president of the United States. Oh, well, there you go. Look at that. But his personality is going to be the key. Not a bad man per se, but is very arrogant, very haughty, and doesn't play well with others. That's not a good trait for a politician. Almost the exact opposite. Next guy, old Teddy Roosevelt, TR. You already know his background. We know about his cult of physical culture. Man, when he was the president, the German ambassador would come over, and the German ambassador was a rather rotund man and not, this outdoorsy type. And Roosevelt would come and they'd eat and eat and eat and eat. And he'd say, hey, let's go hiking, or let's go climbing, or let's go swimming. And every time the German ambassador would puke, boy, it made Roosevelt happy. So he's embodied in this big barrel-chested man, but his voice is not quite match up to the rest of him. But hey, that cult of physical culture is there. The outgoing personality, Lord have mercy. Americans love somebody like him. I mean, he might be the Vince McMahon of his era. And he has been the president of the United States before for a term and about 3/4 after the death of William McKinley. And he pledged he would not seek that third term, but he's going to come back and break that pledge due to what he thinks is mismanagement at the top. So the question is he going to be a Republican or a progressive? And if you saw slide 16, he's got a P beside his name. He wanted to run as a Republican, but Taft, as the president, controlled that party machinery. And so what ends up happening is Taft becomes the nominee, and Roosevelt splits off to form his own third party. This ain't going to end up well, because if you're a Republican, you want to keep every single vote for your guy because you got to beat the Democrats. And so now with the Republican Party split, neither one of them stands a good chance, but it's kind of like, what does your book called it? An ego trip that Roosevelt's got. And so he's going to run as a progressive, no matter what it does. Which leads us to the man of the, not of the hour, the outcast, William Taft. He had been a judge. He had been a governor of the Philippines, and after he leaves the White House, he will be appointed as a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, which is probably the job he was best suited for. And I think that's incredible. You've held the highest office in the land. You know what? Put the black robe on me. I'm going to go decide cases. And he'd been, like I said, been a governor of the Philippines, so he understands America's foreign policy. He had been close with Teddy Roosevelt. Matter of fact, was his handpicked successor, had served as Secretary of War, and now he's the incumbent president, and it is hard to beat an incumbent. Don't let anybody fool you. It's hard. George Herbert Walker Bush losing to Bill Clinton in 1992 was an anomaly. Okay? It should not have happened historically, but it did. Okay? So it's not easy. Even when Jimmy Carter lost to Ronald Reagan, people are like, oh, Reagan blew him out of the water. That's 84. In 1980, it was not nearly as big of a deal. But what happens is, old Taft, he becomes more conservative than Teddy Roosevelt wants, and there's a lot of friction there. And Teddy thinks he sold him out, and then he tried to do away with some of that conservation piece. Woo. So now Teddy's back, and he's mad. It's kind of like that old Eminem song, Slim Shady's back, so here we go. So then we've got Eugene. I think that's the perfect picture for him. Man was a union organizer. I mean, he's a rebel rouser. He leads a lot of the railroad strikes. The rascal gets arrested and thrown in jail every time you turn around, but he doesn't start as a socialist. That is an evolution. It starts because he sees the abuses and the usurpation of power that these big businesses come up with. And so over time, he becomes a socialist. He said that's the only way to make it fair for everybody. But what he's looking at is American socialism rather than European socialism. And we're going to get to that when we end up in World War One. Okay, so we're not going to fool with that right now. Platforms. I mean, look at there. Now, tell me old Teddy Roosevelt don't look like Trump shaking that finger at somebody. But you look at the Republicans. High import tariff. Put limits on female and child labor. Ain't nobody going to argue with that. Want workers' compensation laws. I mean, that's this. I'm talking this stuff right here is high-end, cutting-edge stuff. Limit female labor, limit child labor. Oh, my goodness. Compensation for people injured on the job. Look at here. But here's what they don't want. You know, we're going to put some cutting-edge stuff, but we don't want to go too far. We don't want initiative, referendum, and recall. But we also do not want bad trust, because we've got to regulate or even break them up. We like the Federal Trade Commission because they can fix things up for us and make sure that companies are not, that they're not doing. I'm just going to use the phrase bad stuff. That's all I can come up with right now. And they wanted America to stay on the gold standard instead of having a bimetal system, which is silver and gold. And we're for the conservation of natural resources because they are finite. And here you see of old Taft. And you see the whistle of prosperity being blown right there. I mean, this is good. This good, clean family fun right here, or a good, clean family platform. Some cutting edge, but not too far. Those over here, the Democrats. What do they want? They want government to control the monopolies. Trust are bad. Not Teddy Roosevelt and his good trust, bad trust. No, trust are bad in general, so we got to eliminate them. I'm going to do something, break them up, do something. Reduce that tariff. Because the tariff causes prices to increase for everybody, and that's bad. Then they came up with this crazy idea of a one-term president. Now that's interesting because their man who's going to win, Woodrow Wilson, serves 2 terms. But they are for the direct election of senators. That is an increase in democracy, a creation of a Department of Labor, strengthening that Sherman Antitrust Act, but guess what? We don't support women's suffrage. Not in 1912, the Democrats didn't. Oh, and by the way, we don't want a central bank. Nah, don't need all that. This is their platform known as Wilson's New Freedom. All right? Couple of hours weekly. Check out old Wilson there. Talking about how he cleaned up New Jersey. I'm for Wilson in an 8-hour workday. I mean, that's pretty standard now. So let's go to our man, Teddy, in the Progressive Party. What do they want? Women have the right to vote. A graduated income tax, meaning the more you make, the greater percentage you pay, which is what we have right now. An inheritance tax for the rich, lowered tariffs, limits on campaign spending, currency reform to expand the money supply, minimum wage laws, welfare or social insurance, and abolition of child labor and workers' compensation. When I first put this presentation together, which was in 2011, every single one of these was in effect. So it took, in 100 years, the progressives had everything they asked for. Now, the limits on campaign spending have been kind of rolled back under a couple of cases, but most of those are now here, and that's called new nationalism. So it's amazing how much something that happened well over 100 years ago can come back. So here we go. Good, the Bull Moose Party there, and the anti-third term principle of George Washington pointing at you. So what do the old socialists want? Government to own the stuff, railroads, utilities. Should say graduated income tax, not guaranteed. Sorry about that. Get rid of the tariff. 8-hour workday for everybody. Better housing. Government's going to inspect the factories. Women get the right to vote. Almost all of that has come to fruition. Okay? Tariffs are very low today. We do have standards in housing. The governments do inspect factories out. In fact, OSHA will show up here at school at some point. Women do have the right to vote. Graduated income tax. The government doesn't own those utilities, but it does regulate them hard. Okay? So most of what the socialists want has come to fruition. And I love that button. It's not for the 1912 election, but I love it. Good old Eugene Debs, convict number 9653. As a result of this election, when I used to use this slide in class, I had to be very careful. That magazine's name is Puck with a P. Oh, they just get all kinds of fun with that. Let's look at that Republican nomination. Teddy shows up. He wants to be the man. The Republicans are like, nah, you're too crazy. You're too radical. You're too reform-minded. We can't control you. So what happens? Just what I told you. They were split into two separate parties. Taft gets Republican nomination. TR gets forms his own party, and then the progressives, and he. So the real battle becomes Woodrow Wilson versus Teddy Roosevelt. And I've got a very similar slide on the Woodrow Wilson PowerPoint. And so what you see here is the balance. Teddy's square deal about regulating bad trust and protecting business versus Wilson's new freedom, reducing the tariff, reforming banking, and beating up on the trust. And so that's the real shift right there. That's the real battle. And that's going to be at the core of it. Even though the ancillary issues are what will decide it, that's the core. Now, if you notice here, here's a good old markup ballot. Somebody's wanting you to vote for Eugene Debs. My goodness. Or notice this says copy of the ballot. For the longest time, you brought your own to the polling place. You didn't go there and get one and mark it with your pen and fill in the ovals. You brought your own with you. Okay? That is in. So anyway, so what you get is a split of the Republican Party. That's one gear. You get the socialists cranking up. That's another gear. You get the solid South and Wilson as a Democrat, and you got another gear spinning already. And so what you get is nothing more than a mathematical equation. Republicans divided by the bull moose equals Democrat Woodrow Wilson as president, though he is a minority president. And again, I'll go over that in the other right here. When you look at this, you look at all that red, which is Wilson the Democrat, and you're thinking, man, that was a landslide. And you look at the electoral college, God, he got 82% of the electoral. Oops, don't mean to do that. Let's go back. You can't go back. But when you start looking at those numbers, and you can see it in the other lecture, Woodrow Wilson got well less than half of the vote. So you have a very split election. And so Eugene Debs, he ain't done, but that's the high point. They get 6% of that popular vote. 6% of America voted for Eugene Debs. Remember, this is men. There's not men and women. It's 6% of all the men did. Okay? Well, what happens? 1916, he doesn't run. But in 1920, he's in a jail cell for him lashing out against World War I, so he runs again. All right? And so what happens is by the 1920s, Bolshevism and the Bolshevik revolutions and the twin revolutions over in Russia, the deposition of the Tsar and the rise of the Bolsheviks under Lenin and some of the excesses of that Russian Civil War are going to basically destroy the Socialist Party as they get associated with that. A lot of results here. Wilson. Let's take a look at our man Woodrow. He wins, but again, he's a minority president. He doesn't have what we would term a mandate. And he's wholly unsuited to the job. Personality's not right. His personal philosophy is just a little bit odd. He's an academic. He sees things in terms of black and white, right and wrong. This is how it's supposed to look on paper, but it's not really how it works, and that's frustrating to him. But he's going to do some things in those first few years before the war breaks out, World War I that is, that are going to have a lasting impact. So what happens to old Teddy? The Progressive Party is going to die out. They say, you can't do this. You can't pull the Ross-Perot in 1992 and split the Republican Party. So they die out. Teddy Roosevelt left the party, refuses to do it again in 1914 during the interim election. It's just a little bit of a mess. So Roosevelt, his political career is done after this little fiasco. And Taft. He leaves the White House. Republicans lost the presidency. They lost both houses of Congress. But like I said, he goes on to serve on the Supreme Court, which is what he should do. And so that leads us into the very heart of the tail end, which is strange way to put it. But we're right there at the high tide of progressivism. But something's going to happen in Sarajevo. A fellow by the name of Gavrilo Princip, a member of the Black Hand Party, is going to assassinate Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie going down the street. And it's going to set off a chain of events that's going to cause progressivism to end. Okay, and a conservative backlash to ensue over the next 17 years, and about 17 years at that stage. Okay, so the next slide is shows you where I got all this stuff. Yay me for doing it the right way. Again, if you've got any questions about this, you email me. You've got my email, or you can text or call, no problem. But this should get us into that part about Woodrow Wilson and the high point of progressivism, and will set us up for a little bit of a dive into World War I next week.